Hello, and welcome to Charted, an astrology podcast. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about Saturn. So far we have looked at all the planets, all the visible planets, I should say, from the luminaries, the inner planets, the outer planets. Now we're on the last of the outer planets. That's going to be Saturn, and it's the last visible planet. I think technically you could see Uranus under certain very specific circumstances, but it's very rare and it's something you'd never notice unless you knew exactly where to look. So we're not going to really count that as a visible planet because it's, for all intents and purposes, not. But the planets beyond Saturn are what I consider generational planets, right? They move too slow. But Saturn still very much kind of has a personal quality to it. Right? It takes about 29 and a half years to go around the sun. So about the same amount of time, give or take, around the zodiac, which means it's going to spend about 2.5 years per sign. Right? So there's still quite a bit of a personal nature to it. But it's still very slow moving, right? Saturn also, as I said, being the last of the visible planets means it's going to deal with this idea of the last thing we see, right? The kind of the horizon, the end point of something. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But if we think of the progression we've gone through with the other planets, right? We had the sun, which is the self, the conscious self. And then that kind of flows out to the moon, right? The moon being the body, kind of the physical self, the reflection of the sun. But you have this kind of corridor between them of Mercury and Venus kind of representing very personal qualities that kind of help us deal with the solar and lunar concepts within us, right? The masculine, feminine parts of ourselves, the conscious, the unconscious. And Mercury and Venus kind of act as that kind of translationary kind of go between them. And they help us deal with things coming from the outside world, but they're not really meant to be external for the most part. And then we have Mars, right? We step into the outer planets, and Mars is about taking our own sense of personal willpower and projecting it outwards, right? To acquire things, to change reality in whatever shape we're trying to change it. And so Mars projects ourselves out into the broader scope of the world. And then what do we get from there? We get the expansiveness of Jupiter, because Jupiter is positive. It's about a positive mindset, a positive belief in things beyond the self. And so as we move out into the world, what do? We rub shoulders with other people. We come into contact with other people. We learn new cultures, learn new religions, learn new experiences. We acquire things. This is why Jupiter represents abundance, right? So you have all this kind of positive stuff coming from experiencing the world. But the thing is at some point there's a limit to all that, right? And that's kind of where Saturn comes in. Saturn is in a lot of ways going to be the flip side of Jupiter. So let's dive in. Let's talk about the astronomy first. As I mentioned, Saturn has about a 29.5-year orbit. So it's going to be moved pretty slowly around the zodiac. Saturn return is something that a lot of people kind of take note of, because it's going to happen about every 30-ish years. And you will typically notice kind of a like coming of maturity kind of event, right? At those points. And again, we'll talk about that later. Saturn also is a gas giant, just like Jupiter, right? So it's made of what gas? Gas is air. So it's going to be one of the social planets, right? It's going to deal with things that are more society-oriented in nature. We get their qualities from dealing with the broader world, not really from our own kind of innate self. So it's a quality that really is coming from outside us. But that's a good thing, because we get something that we didn't otherwise have. If we think of the sun and the moon and the zodiac really fast, both of them are opposite to Saturn-ruled signs. So in a lot of ways, Saturn really truly is kind of something we only get from others, right? Or experience from others, or from things beyond the self in a lot of ways. Saturn has rings, which is curious because we're going to talk about this in a moment, but the idea of boundaries or limits, and you have a planet that has rings kind of representing that boundary in a sense, right? It's the only planet that has that. So it is kind of a curious extra thing about it. The last thing is Saturn is a very faint and kind of brownish star. When you look up at it in the sky, it's very brownish and dull in color, right? And as I've mentioned in some of the previous episodes, the benefic stars or benefic planets, they're very bright looking stars, right? They look vibrant. They look really, really special, right? They're noticeable within the night sky. Mars is noticeable because it's red, but otherwise it's kind of, red always kind of invokes that sense of like anger, aggression, right? Which is what it represents. But Saturn has a dingy color to it, right? It's kind of ugly. It's kind of faded. It doesn't look very bright. And that's going to play into a lot of what Saturn represents, right? So what could we say about something that's not very special? It's of low value. It's of low worth. It's of common, right? It's ordinary, right? It's not special. And so Saturn, that's going to be a big thing as a part of what Saturn represents. So if we take all of that then, right, being the last visible planet, very slow moving, right? So it's something that comes with time. Time is going to be a big thing for Saturn. A lot of time is needed to acquire it, to kind of mature into it, right? And it's also going to be something that's common and ugly and of low worth or common worth, and something we get from society, from the broader scope of the world. When we put all that together, what we get is we get negativity. And what do I mean by that? Well, negativity implies that we are subtracting, right? Is a negative application of something. So what does that mean? Well, there's going to be a couple things. Number one, boundaries and limits is going to be the first and most obvious thing, right? Let's think about this. If I'm alive, what's the negative, right, kind of application of that? Would be unalive, right? It would be death. So the limit then of a life, right, is the length of the life. It's mortality, right? And so that's the limiting factor then, the thing that's negatively applied, right? If we think of, say, I have a bunch of food on the table. I could eat all of it, be very, very full and feel kind of gross. Or I could have, self-restraint. I could limit my desire to eat all the food, even though it tastes really good. Right? So that's kind of a more positive application of this negativity. I'm subtracting from my own desire in order to achieve a different goal. Some other things that Saturn can subtract, right? It's going to be belief. What's a negative form of belief? It's disbelief or doubt, right? Or pessimism. One of Jupiter's flaws, very Jupiterian people especially, I'd say Pisces is probably the worst in this way, but Sagittarius definitely struggles with it too, is they're extremely optimistic to the extent that they're willing to believe everything, right? When you believe everything, you get tricked and you tend to make mistakes. Because if I believe I can fly, right, it's going to be a hard reality when I try to fly and jump off a cliff and I cannot. So this is where the kind of the positive aspect of, or the, I should say, beneficial aspect of negativity comes in. When you doubt things, it means you're going to be more cautious, more pragmatic in how you look at it. Does this really make sense? Can I actually fly? Well, I understand there's this thing called gravity, and I'm pretty heavy, so maybe not, right? And that's what Saturn gives us. It gives us the ability to have a negative outlook on something, a negative mindset towards something. And as I said, that can be very helpful. It can give us a sense of pessimism that's needed to be pragmatic, to be scientific, right? To question things. Questioning things is a natural result of doubting them, which is, again, a negative concept. As I said, boundaries, limits for things is another negative application or beneficial application. Why? Well, if we're always expanding outwards, right, then everything would effectively be infinite. Then there would be no distinguishing. Everything would simply be all together, right? We'd be infinitely kind of conjoining together, and it would just be one giant blob of everything in the universe. So you have to have some limit to things to the extent that they can exist, right? We have cells. Cells have like walls, right? We're molecules. We have skin, right? Skin keeps all the harmful things out and keeps our insides from spilling out. Right? That's a Saturnian concept. It's a boundary. It's a limit. Because that's necessary to form something that distinguishes. Right? This idea of distinguishing things is certainly going to be very Aquarian. We'll talk about that when we get to the signs. But Saturn wants to isolate stuff. And when you isolate stuff, you can see what it is. Right? It's very obvious. Right? You know now, okay, it's this thing. I can distinguish it. So isolating and distinguishing is a very Saturnian thing. It's a beneficial application of what negativity? Because when you subtract down, eventually you're left with the single component. And then it ultimately past that would be nothing. So Saturn's going to deal with this idea of isolation. It's going to deal with the concepts of kind of our negative mental patterns, right? So doubt, fear is another one, right? Depression. Why? Because they're all negative influences on our other feelings. Depression is a negative form of emotion. Fear is a negative form of bravery, right? Optimism. So Saturn really wants to deal with how we set boundaries, right? I said it's a social planet. Where do we learn boundaries on a social level? Well, through other people, through relationships, right? We learn, okay, what makes sense within society? What can I do and not do, right? Laws are what? Boundaries. They're limits. They're constraints. They're things that we put around us in order to function, right? So these ideas of boundaries are very necessary for survival because, as I said, either you have something where everything just is infinitely jumbling together, right? Or on a more abstract level, right, with something like society, if you have no law, if you have no order, right, you have chaos. True freedom is chaotic and leads to a lot of unpredictable and probably messy results. Right? And so that's where the idea of boundaries come in, limitations, right? So that's the essence of what Saturn's about. The hard part of Saturn then is it's going to be all these things. They're hard to deal with. It's hard to deal with things that limit you. It's hard to deal with things that restrain you because that requires struggle. It requires effort. One other thing I mentioned is, right, Saturn is the limit on all things, which means, as I said, it's the limit on mortality. But because it's the limit on the length that something can exist, Saturn is therefore going to represent the longevity of things, right? Because it's setting the limit for what it can exist as, right? And I know that's kind of a slightly abstract concept, but Saturn represents longevity. It's baked into what it is simply because it's the endpoint, or it's what determines the endpoint, right? Because it's that kind of reducing it down to something that has a boundary to its existence. So Saturn deals with death. Saturn deals with restraint. It deals with isolation. And it deals with length, durability, longevity. I mentioned when I was talking about the kind of the how is a star, it's kind of ugly. It's kind of faint and kind of gross looking, kind of brownish, dingy, dull. And how it represents kind of a low value or lack of being special, right? So that's another component with Saturn, is it's going to represent things that are common. They have no inherent worth. Right? And this is another aspect of kind of this kind of social nature to Saturn. Right? When you're part of a large group, what happens? You begin to lose right? Any sense of being anything special, being above the group necessarily. When everybody's kind of in the same class, as it were, right? You have a group of students, let's say. Once the crowd gets large enough, they become indistinguishable, right? They become nothing special. And that's not to say it. People aren't special, right? We all are unique. We all have our things that make us us. But the reality is once you get a large group of people, then it begins to be less distinguishable, right? And so there's a kind of a commonality between us. And uniqueness in a lot of ways is what drives value, right? Which is why when we look at Saturn sign Aquarius, it simultaneously wants to be a part of society, but separate, where it can be unique and distinguish itself from something that it's otherwise just kind of blending into. But it has to do, again, with that kind of low station, something that's not very worthwhile. Why? Because it doesn't shine brightly. Again, what are limits? They're the boundary, the end of something, right? It's the limit of existence. If we have light that's shining outwards, right, at some point we get too far and that light no longer can go anywhere, right? It fades. When a star gets too far from Earth, we can no longer see it, right? It's too faint. And that's kind of that idea of why Saturn is opposite to the sun and the moon, right? It's the thing that kind of snuffs out the lights in a sense, right? Because the absence of light, which again is not very special. Right? It's kind of why would you want, if you're thinking about this in kind of an abstract way, if you're thinking like, oh, I want to value the stars in the sky, right? You would want the brightest, the ones that show off light, not the ones that kind of dull the light. So Saturn's going to represent the things that have kind of, like I said, common value, things that don't have much worth. But just because something's common doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Right? You think of a hammer. Hammers are very common. They're cheap. They're easy to make. But they're extremely useful. Right? There's a certain effectiveness to a hammer. You can build a lot of things with a hammer. Get some nails and you're good to go. And so that's the thing, is just because something's common doesn't mean it's not useful. And that I want to make that distinguishing remark. Now, Saturn, to kind of sum up, as I said, it's at its core, it's about negativity, right? And it's accomplished through seeing and interacting with the broader world. Where do we get some of the kind of the negative concepts of, especially the mental concepts of Saturn? Things like doubt, fear, depression, anxiety. Anxiety is kind of a couple different things, but you get it because you interact with people or have a family dynamic that encourages those things, that presents opportunities where that stuff is now put in you, where you are fearful, right? Situations that cause you to fear because you see danger. Right? And what is a fear response? Right? Something is more powerful than us, right? We wouldn't just want to blindly walk into it and put our life at risk, right? Fear is a response that says, hey, I need to get out of this. Right? It's a good application of something. Now, obviously, we can become too fearful. And this is the hard part with Saturn, is we have too much of it, or it's afflicting too many things. You have too much restriction, and it becomes challenging because you have to overcome it. I mentioned earlier the Saturn return, the difficulty with Saturn return, why people see it as kind of a maturing point, right? Especially your first one, is because it's, from just looking at it, the zodiac, it's like your birthday of Saturn, where it is in your chart. But what it is a moment in time where you're now being tested, right? You're being put in a situation where the Saturnian struggles of something, right? Depending on where it's at in your chart, what it's aspecting, right? What house it's in. That's going to now show up and say, okay, here you go. Here's the limitations. How do you handle it? Here are the restrictions. Here are the things you have to grind through. And as I said, that's something that requires maturity. It's something that requires time and effort and struggle and toil. This is why the Saturnian signs tend to be okay with harder, difficult things, especially Capricorn, right? They can handle struggle because it's inherent to what Saturn is. You don't build good boundaries. You don't build good self-discipline. That's another kind of beneficial aspect of this negative application towards yourself, right? What are you being when you're self-disciplined? You're restraining yourself in a way that is beneficial, right, to achieve things. And this is what Saturn's really going to give you if you have a good Saturn, or know how to cope with Saturn, right? Is become restrictive of the things that otherwise trip you up. So, to sum up, Saturn represents negativity, which means it represents the things that restrain us, but also the limits that we can put on ourselves to help us achieve things, as well as the limits we can put towards how we deal with other people, right? Boundaries between other people. If you're standing in line, you don't want them standing all up in your space, right? Standing, a centimeter away from you. That's weird. I mean, maybe you like that. That's fine. They'd question it. But that's the thing, though. We have personal space. Or how are you in a relationship, for example? Do you set good boundaries, or do you let somebody kind of push for what they want, even if it's something you don't want all the time? Right? Having a good sense of boundaries is what allows you to have healthy relationships and not get taken advantage of. Right? And it could be a work relationship, boundaries with your boss, boundaries with your coworkers, and so on. And that's stuff that we have. And then so Saturn's going to represent this sense of boundaries. It's also going to be things that isolate, right? To help us distinguish things. Now, it can also be isolation in a kind of more negative sense, right? We are getting isolated from things. But when you're isolated, what happens? You can be very introspective. You can consider what's actually happening, right? You can see yourself for what you are because you're the only thing that's there. So, if we look at the signs that Saturn rules, right? Rules two signs. It rules Capricorn and Aquarius. Both are opposite to the signs that are ruled by the Sun and the Moon, Leo and Cancer. So starting with Capricorn, what is Capricorn about? Well, it's a cardinal earth sign. So it's about initiating change in reality. And it's ruled by Saturn, which means it's doing it in a way that's diligent, requires restraint, hard work, effort. Why? Why does this work? Why is Saturn there instead of like Mars? Why? Mars is exalted in Capricorn, but why not Venus? Why not, Mercury? Well, the thing is if you think about building a house, for example, right? There's a very, cardinal earth type of thing, type of activity. You want to build a house. That requires a lot of planning and a lot of diligence and very hard work. If you've ever worked in construction, it is not easy. It's very difficult, very hard on your body. And as I said, it requires a lot of hard work and a lot of time and effort. And it requires that you do things correctly so that the house doesn't fall down. So if you want to make changes in physical reality, right, it's something that requires immense effort. It's not something you want to make changes in terms of social groups. It's pretty easy. You just have to convince people, right? I mean, it's not super easy, but it doesn't require much effort other than speaking, right? But if you're going to change physical reality, it requires that you actually physically are getting up and moving and doing things. And so you need that sense of self-restraint, that sense of discipline in order to accomplish that kind of change, because that physical change is very hard to do and requires, like I said, a great deal of effort. And so that's why Saturn rules Capricorn. So Capricorn is about building things. So it's about initiating change in the physical world. And so Capricorn has a very kind of dry, pragmatic way of doing things. One thing I didn't mention, I don't know why this escaped me, but Saturn is very detached, right? We see this in the idea of it's wanting to isolate things. What is the negative response to emotions, right? Attachments. It's disattachment, detachment, right? So Saturn is very detached from things. And part of the reason is because if you're attached to something, right, if you have an emotional connection to it, it's hard to see it objectively. And if you can't see something objectively, how do you set a good boundary, right? How can you look at it in a way, right, that's helpful, right? Think of the idea, again, Saturn wants to isolate things, which means you have to what? You have to remove it from yourself, right? You cannot be attached to something you are isolating. So Saturn represents attachment, which means Capricorn and Aquarius, as we'll talk about in a second, are very detached. They're emotionally detached from things. It's not to say that people that have Capricorn placements, especially Capricorn moon or Aquarius moon, aren't emotional people. They certainly are. Everybody has emotions. But it means the way in which they move through the world, these signs, and the way they want to operate is very emotionally detached. It's very pragmatic, very businesslike. At least for Capricorn, very businesslike. It sees how change is needed, and it acts on it. It can be quite ruthless. The opposite to Capricorn is Cancer. And Cancer is obviously ruled by the moon, so it's about these emotional attachments. Right? Cancer wants to attach to the things that it produces, and it wants to nurture them and grow them. But the thing about growing is it's not about what I do, really, because I'm not the thing growing, right? I'm growing something else. Right? You're growing a child, you're growing a flower, a plant, a garden. Maybe you have a project that you're slowly nurturing. But that process requires that you tend to it, but you don't control the outcome. You're not the one actually doing the thing, right? I'm not growing up for my children. They're growing up. I'm influencing them, right? I'm teaching them. I'm feeding them. I'm providing for them. I'm obviously showing them love and care, but I'm not the one growing, right? I'm not forcing their growth. They're growing. I'm just there to kind of supplement. And that's the nature of Cancer, is it wants to grow things. It doesn't want to build them. And so it has this attentive care, because to grow something requires that you are attached to it, that you are caring for it, that you are always watching it to make sure you know when something is needed, because you're not the thing that's growing. And so that's the big difference between Capricorn and Cancer. It's kind of not really where I wanted to go with that, but now you know a little bit. And so why Saturn is in detriment in Cancer is because it's in a place where it wants to isolate when attachment is needed. And so you have to grow and nurture through what? Self-restraint, through detachment. Right? You have to use a more negative application of growth. Right? So it becomes a bit harder. It can also be an emotional form of determining your boundaries, determining your self-restraints, which can be challenging, because if you want to have good boundaries, you want to have good self-restraint, that requires that you, detach and look at yourself objectively to see what is the best way to go. Whereas Cancer wants to be more intuitive, right? It's ruled by the moon. It wants to use that kind of subconscious and emotional mind to influence the direction that it moves. So with Saturn's in Cancer, you get somebody whose boundaries, whose self-restraint, right, is all formulated and kind of controlled by a more emotional sense, which can be quite detrimental. The other Saturn-ruled sign is going to be Aquarius. And Aquarius is a very odd sign. It's very paradoxical in a lot of ways. It is a fixed air sign. And if we think about what this means, right, fixed air, think of the wind. I don't know how else you would think of it in the real world, but air signs are social. And what is fixed? It means you want to attach, you want to hold on to. Hold on to what? Society, people, ideas, intellect, right? Those are the things that an air sign would be. And so with Aquarius, you have a sign that's wanting to hold on to those things. But how do you hold on to them? How do you hold on to lots of ideas? How do you hold on to people? Right? You have to have some kind of way to do that, some way to kind of keep them contained. And so that's why Saturn rules Aquarius, because it allows for the kind of distinguishing of a variety of different people, lots of peoples. Aquarius is the most collective of the air signs. Gemini is very kind of interpersonal. It likes to talk to people. Libra is very much more about like kind of a group of people and kind of organizing them, directing them. But Aquarius is more society oriented. It's looking at the broad scope, all of the people. And what it wants to do is it wants to take this Saturnian isolation, right, to distinguish and see and separate and organize them into their hierarchies within society. But because Aquarius, right, is ruled by Saturn, it means there's a natural sense of commonality, right? So it's in tune with the people and the needs of the people and what they think and how they operate. And so Aquarius is naturally very, very in tune with society. Most Aquarian people are really well received, typically, even if they're super quirky, which the reason they're super quirky is because, again, Saturn is kind of common. It doesn't have any sense of value. And when you don't value yourself, you're kind of just there. And that's not to say an Aquarius is always not going to value itself. That's kind of a separate discussion. But really what I'm trying to say is there's a lack of, I don't want to say self-respect because it's not quite the right word, but Saturn it's open to being goofy and different and kind of quirky because it kind of doesn't care. It's detached, right? And so in spite of having a kind of strong ability to resonate with society, Aquarius has this kind of detached nature. It's very much embodies the idea of love humans and hate people, right? Where it's trying to kind of be a part of society, but at the same time separate. Intellectually, right? When we have information that comes in and different ideas and different thoughts, because we've talked to people, that's what we do, right? Gemini is out talking to everybody. And so if you think of the other air signs, they're dealing with people, which means you're always going to get lots of other ideas. So what do you do with them? Do they all just go in the same pot and kind of blend together? Right? That's the problem Pisces has, where everything blends together and there's no distinguishing. No, Saturn wants to isolate. So it distinguishes them and organizes them and sets them apart within the mind. So you have a very structured mind that's capable of seeing all the different components and how they're laid out and how they fit together. It's not quite like Virgo, where it's trying to piece it together and fix it and look at all the tiny details, but it's more of an organizational thing. So Aquarius is very organized because it has this Saturnian mind that's able to isolate and distinguish and set boundaries on things. Mental boundaries, social boundaries. The opposite of Aquarius is Leo. And Leo is about self, right? Which is kind of the opposite of society. If we think of Saturn's about limits, right? It's our own limits on ourselves as well as the kind of limits we project outward to deal with society, right? But when you limit yourself and your self is wanting to be expressive, what do you get? You get somebody who's representing themselves or expressing themselves through limitations. Alternatively, they're trying to use their limitations in a way that's mostly centered around themselves. It's not resonant with the rest of society. So it's a very much kind of embodies this idea of my own boundaries, right? Not society's boundaries, my own boundaries. And that doesn't always work with society when you're the one setting your own rules. It's hard to operate in a world where that works. Now, you can make it function for sure, but it's tricky. And that's why Saturn is in detriment in Leo. Saturn is exalted in Libra. And this one's kind of, at first glance, might not make sense. But then when you think about it, it's like, oh, no, this really makes sense. What's Libra about? Libra is a cardinal air sign ruled by Venus. And Libra's big thing is it kind of wants to find balance, find intellectual balance, right? As well as social balance, social harmony. Why? Because it's ruled by Venus. It loves people, right? And it sees the value in people. And so what you get when you have Saturn in Libra is you have this planet that's about what? Boundaries and common things, low station, right? In a sign that's about what? Finding balance and finding equality. Saturn's able to set boundaries, set laws, set the limitations on people and intellectually, and you put it in a place of balance, and what do you get? You get fair and equitable laws. You get laws and restrictions and limitations that are excellent because they're always taking everyone into account. The difference in this sense between Aquarius and Libra is Aquarius doesn't care about hierarchy. It understands that, right? That's innate to it. Some people are of low class and some people are of high class. Okay, but it's just defining the structure between them, the limits between them, the boundaries between them. But with Libra, because it values people, it's willing to say, no, let's make these boundaries equal. Let's make these boundaries between the different groups of society equal so that they both have the same, right, status or the same thing. So you get justice, really true justice, I would say. It's kind of the embodiment, the ideal embodiment of Saturn and Libra. The United States, for example, in the U.S., the Sibley chart is the most common birth chart for the United States people use. It has Saturn exalted in Libra, right? If you look at the early years of the United States, I'd say post maybe Civil War, maybe World War II, somewhere kind of in that time frame, things kind of shifted, and I don't know if I'd follow this as much anymore. But in the early years of the United States, they had one of the most robust judicial systems and fair judicial systems on the planet, right? That idea of, hey, we have a law that's really based on equality. And that's the kind of the true nature of why Saturn is exalted in Libra, right? Is because you take it from a place of low worth and put it in a place of high worth and give it the that kind of isolating nature, that boundary, that limiting nature in a place where it's naturally equitable and fair and just for others. And so you have a very fair sense of boundaries when you have Saturn in Libra. Now, that means that Saturn is, not exalted, but in fall in Aries. And Aries is cardinal fire sign ruled by Mars. And the reason that Saturn is fall in Aries is because Aries is about action, for one, and aggression. But it's about acting on my own self. And so you get the kind of negative side of Saturn and Leo, right? My boundaries that I want to set. But now you've got it in a way that's truly me, myself, and I, with no regard for anyone else. It is not fair in the slightest. It's the opposite of fairness. It's the opposite of justice. Why? Because it's trying to push the boundaries, really, is what you get. You get somebody who has a sense of boundaries that are entirely based on what they need to do in the moment. Right? If I need this food, okay. Pushing the boundaries. I need this food. And so it can be exceedingly hard to work with in society, right? Boundaries are what allow us to operate with other people in a way that's healthy, maintains kind of civility. So with Saturn in Aries, you lose a lot of that ability to see what is necessary in others. So it's a lot of pushing of boundaries. Alternatively, it can be a lot of restriction on your own sense of self-actualization. That's the other downside with Leo as well, is Saturn is really limiting the self. So you get somebody who's kind of impotent, at least with Saturn and Aries, or can be play out that way. Last thing regarding Saturn, I think I may have forgot to cover this in the episode on Jupiter and Mars, but I know I'll do an episode on the houses at some point, so I'll certainly cover that then. But in terms of the houses, each of the planets has one house that's considered its joy. It's a place where these significations of the house kind of match the planet. And which house is the house that is the joy of Saturn? It's the 12th house. 12th house sucks. If you have planets there, yeah, it's a hard place. Why? Because it isolates. It's about aloneness, solitude, exile, depression, right? Fear. The things in the 12th house are unknown because they've been isolated to a place where they cannot be seen. And so the 12th house is a place where we have a lot of our limiting mental hang-ups. Right? It's the house of undoings is another name for it. And what are undoings? It's the things that trip us up. Right? It's the things that hold us back. They're limitations, which is what Saturn represents. So Saturn's in its joy in the 12th. It's a very hard place for Saturn, honestly, because you get a very afflicted mental game going on for you. So to sum up, as we've discussed, Saturn represents negativity and all things that embodies. That means limitations, it means boundaries, it means things like doubt, pessimism, fear. Saturn wants to subtract and to isolate, right? To keep in a place where it's contained and distinguished. Saturn rules Aquarius, it rules Capricorn, and it's in detriment in Cancer and Leo. And then it is exalted in Libra and in fall in Aries. So that's everything with Saturn. In the next episode, as I believe I mentioned at the beginning of this one, we're going to go through the generational planets and kind of get an overview of them, and then we'll dive through each of the three. I'm not going to go through anything beyond Pluto because personally I don't really use anything past Pluto, other than maybe Chiron, which is a comet. I don't know if I'll talk about Chiron in this kind of series. I'm sure I will eventually, but it's besides the point. So anyway, I hope that you have enjoyed the podcast so far. Thank you for listening. I am a practicing astrologer, so if you're interested in a reading, you can always go to my website, which is www.jdastrology.com, or you can just reach out to me in my email, james@jdastrology. And I think that's pretty much it. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening.